Okay, so this is your Unit 6 GI lecture. Again, here are the objectives for the lecture and the associated chapters in your textbook that you can refer to. And again, I'm going to be flipping back and forth between lecture and slides. So just make sure you have the PowerPoint up next to you as well so you can refer to those and be following along on your unit outline when I flip to those pictures, okay? So gastrointestinal system review. So right now we're looking at structures and functions. And so I'm going to move to a slide here really quick. Okay, so with our GI system, looking at some of the structures here. So major GI organs and functions. So the first structure we're really talking about is the esophagus. And our esophagus right here, as you can see in the picture, is for transport. Okay, so it moves food via peristalsis, right? That movement of the esophagus into the stomach. So food basically enters the stomach through what we call the cardiac sphincter. Okay, and then it's known as either the cardiac or esophageal sphincter. You can hear it kind of used as either or. And that sphincter remains closed except for during swallowing. So it keeps those food contents within the stomach so it doesn't come back up the esophagus. So this slide just kind of goes over the few things I was speaking about in regards to the esophagus. And here you see it here, and then here you see labeled lower esophageal sphincter. So remember that's referred to as the cardiac or esophageal sphincter. So the stomach is actually connected to the esophagus and the small intestine. And the pyloric sphincter is actually what controls emptying of the stomach. So we have a process called digestion. In the process of digestion, we have secretion of hydrochloric acid. Okay, those are secreted from the parietal cells that actually line the stomach. So we have hydrochloric acid that's being secreted, and that's going to aid in digestion and also help serve as a barrier to infection. In regard to acid-base balance, our stomach actually secretes something called bicarbonate. Okay, so it secretes bicarb. Bicarb is basically a base that is a natural mechanism to prevent hyperacidity. So bicarb comes from our stomach. All right, and when we're looking at the liver, and I'll flip back and forth here. So I have images of the liver and the gallbladder. So in terms of the liver, when we're looking at storage, protection, and metabolism, so specifically about the liver actually stores blood, vitamins, and minerals. Protection-wise, it helps filter toxins such as ETOH. ETOH is basically what we're referring to there as alcohol and other drugs. Metabolism, liver also helps to metabolize carbs, proteins, and fats, and it actually secretes bile. Bile is actually stored in the gallbladder, but it comes from the liver. So let's flip to the gallbladder here so we can talk about that. So in regard to storage in terms of the gallbladder, that's where bile is stored, right? The gallbladder stores bile that's actually made from the liver. Protection mainly comes from the liver, but in terms of metabolism, when we're talking about the gallbladder, so food containing fats actually enter the duodenum, and we have hormones that stimulate that gallbladder to release bile into the cystic duct, which joins the hepatic duct and forms what's known as the common bile duct, from which bile actually enters the duodenum. So things to remember in regards to bile is very critical for digestion and for absorption of fats. So it consists mainly of dietary triglycerides and cholesterol and fat-soluble vitamins. The gallbladder also aids in eliminating hemoglobin from destroyed RBCs. That is what bilirubin is. Bilirubin is a byproduct of those destroyed RBCs. And it's also a route for elimination of excess cholesterol as it is converted to bile acid and then eliminated in bile. Our pancreas has a few different methods as well. When we look at the pancreas, it has both exocrine and endocrine factors that we'll talk about, okay, or functions, I should say. So it is located between the stomach and the small intestines. But specific to digestion, this is the actual exocrine function of the pancreas, okay? It produces and it excretes enzymes to help digest food. So those enzymes that we're looking at are lipase and amylase. So lipase promotes fat breakdown and absorption, and amylase aids in the digestion of starch. Glucose control would actually be the endocrine function of the pancreas. So for glucose control, that pancreas produces and secretes the pancreatic hormones insulin and glucagon. And that would be the endocrine function of the pancreas. We also have the small intestine. The small intestine is about 20 feet long. It hangs in coils. Pancreatic enzymes and bile from the liver actually enter the duodenum, and it aids in digestion and absorption. So in terms of digestion, we have enzymes in the small intestine that aid to break down carbs, proteins, and fats. And then absorption. So most food, water, vitamins, and minerals are actually absorbed here in the small intestine. Our large intestine is only about 5 feet long, as inclusive of the cecum and the appendix. Absorption, so we have continued absorption that happens here in the large intestine, and this is where we have more absorption of nutrients. But I will tell you, in comparison to the small intestine, the large intestine is where most reabsorption of water happens. So most water is actually going to be absorbed in the large intestine in comparison to the small intestine. Okay. So elimination, we have elimination that actually occurs. So this is where stool formation takes place. So we have stool formation and elimination of indigestible materials. Those materials would consist of things such as fiber, carbohydrate. Fiber is basically a carbohydrate that our body cannot break down and digest. Okay. That's why they say fiber is such a great thing. It helps keep regularity in stools. We can't digest it, so we eliminate it through our stool. And fiber also acts as an appetite suppressant. Assessment we'll get to here in a second. Actually, really what I'm wanting you to see here with this, I'll just go over it briefly now. So when you are completing your physical assessment on your patient, right, we move in a very purposeful manner, okay? So if I were to back up this picture really quick, here you see the large intestine, right? We have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the descending colon, right? So when I look at the assessment, I'm looking at this patient and I'm looking at all 4 quadrants here. This is why we start in that right lower quadrant and we work clockwise, right? So again, go back to the picture. This is why you're doing that. You're starting in the ascending colon, moving to the transverse, and then the descending, right? So ascending, transverse, descending colon. So that's why we actually move in that manner. We want to follow the anatomy of the body. And this is why basic anatomy and physiology is so important, is when you're looking at assessment, okay, in terms of assessment, you always look, right, listen, then feel. That's the order in which we do that. Look, listen, then feel, okay? So when you are listening, and feeling, right, and you go to palpate your patient, or prior to that, you're auscultating that abdomen, if they're having a complaint and they're saying, oh, it's in my right lower side of my belly, right, because I'm probably not going to say right lower quadrant, but you're going to identify it as that. You want to understand, well, what's going on in that right lower quadrant? What's in there? What could be bothering them? So looking at the patient in terms of how that abdomen is broken up into those 4 quadrants, you have an idea of what organs and structures are under there. So you can kind of, guesstimate, take an educated guess basically as to what could be going on with that patient, and how you need to basically critique your assessment. So these are just some things to think about in terms of assessing your patient, and why we specifically assess our patient in that order when it comes to the abdomen, and in many things, as a matter of fact. Age-related changes that actually occur. So as a patient ages, we look at things such as atrophy. So atrophy is basically a gradual decline in effectiveness, or maybe a wasting away due to the degeneration of cells. And that's just going to happen as our age our cells basically age and then maybe even eventually die off, right? So they degenerate. Decreased peristalsis. So this would be the involuntary constriction and relaxation of the muscles of the intestine, right? That's what peristalsis is, right? We don't voluntarily do it, we involuntarily do it. Our body just does it. Involuntary constriction and relaxation of the muscles of the intestine. And that's that wave-like movements that actually push or propel contents forward. Well, as we age, we have decreased peristalsis. We do not have as effective peristalsis as we did when we were younger. And then we also have decreased enzyme activity and synthesis. Gastric acid production. So we are looking at the parietal cells. This is in chapter 50. Our parietal cells, they are in the lining of the stomach, okay? And they produce and secrete hydrochloric acid. That is very important for you to remember, okay? Parietal cells produce and secrete hydrochloric acid. That is the primary site of action for many of the drugs used to actually treat acid-related disorders, okay? With that, these cells are broken down. We have what's called chief cells and mucus cells. Our chief cells produce what's called pepsinogen. That's an enzyme that actually breaks down dietary protein. And then we have mucus cells. Mucus cells are exactly that. They're mucus secreting cells. And they serve as a protective coating against the digestive action of hydrochloric acid and other digestive enzymes. The stomach is responsible for hydrogen production via the proton pump, okay? That is otherwise known as our hydrogen potassium adenosine triphosphate pump, AT-PACE pump. And that is the pump for the transport of hydrogen ions that are actually located in parietal cells. So hydrogen ions are pumped out of the cell into the gastric lumen in exchange for potassium via the action of the proton pump. So that's actually what creates that acidic environment of the stomach. And that's how that proton pump works. And you're going to see some of the medications that we talk about actually affect that proton pump, okay? Production of intrinsic factor. This is a glycoprotein that facilitates gastric absorption of vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is important for red blood cell formation, cell metabolism, nerve function, and even the production of DNA. We think about prostaglandins. Prostaglandins have, and they're depending on where they are, right? We've talked about prostaglandins as an inflammatory mediator, but they also have an anti-inflammatory and protective function. It depends on where they're located. So found in the gastric mucosa, they actually inhibit the secretion or inhibit acid secretion, and they stimulate mucus and bicarbonate secretion, which aids in protecting our stomach and creating more of a basic environment versus an acidic environment. So basically it helps keep the balance between acidity and that environment being basic. Okay. So really from that, although that was a lot of information, the biggest take back in there is you do need to understand how the proton pump actually works. So make sure you review that. And you do need to understand parietal cells. What are they, right? What do they produce or secrete? Receptors. So remember when we talked in our respiratory lecture, we talked about different types of histamine, right? Histamine 1 and histamine 2. Remember, histamine 1 is our itch mediator, our allergic reaction mediator. Histamine 2 actually stimulation of histamine 2 provides energy to the proton pump to produce the hydrogen ions, okay? Acetylcholine, that is a chief neurotransmitter of our parasympathetic nervous system. It contracts smooth muscle, causes dilation of our blood vessels, increases bodily secretion, and decreases our heart rate. Okay. And we have gastrin. Gastrin is a peptide hormone. And so understanding more so from that is that histamine 2, remember we talked about H1 and respiratory, histamine 2, we're specifically talking about that in the stomach, okay? And that histamine 2 stimulation provides energy to the proton pump to produce hydrogen. That's probably the biggest take back out of that particular section. So for function, gastric acid production. So when we talk about function, it maintains the stomach pH around 1 to 4. Digestion. So remember, we have an acidic environment that aids in the proper digestion of food. It needs to be acidic, but properly acidic, right? We don't want it to be too acidic of an environment or too basic of an environment. So we want that pH to be around 1 to 4. So remember, the lower you are on the pH scale, the more acidic. The higher you are on that pH scale, the more basic. And then in terms of defense against infection, hydrochloric acid is your answer. So think about what substances would actually stimulate hydrochloric acid. So there are certain foods that can stimulate that. Caffeine, unfortunately, chocolate, I'm sorry, alcohol, stress, large fatty meals, and even smoking. All of those things can actually trigger or stimulate the production of hydrochloric acid.